Well, we're about to start, but before we do, please be aware of the exit signs in case we need to leave the room in case of an emergency. And those that are on the internet, we really strongly request that you consider sending in your questions at first opportunity so that we have time at the end for the Q&A. So with that, Dr. Patiglio.
Great. Thank you all for coming, and those of you that are attending online, I appreciate that. I'm Sarah Patiglio. I work in the research division at ARB. And this presentation today is part of a series of research projects on alternative fuels that are kind of wrapping up right now. So I think it was on December 2nd, we had a seminar about a project that wrapped up on the production of renewable natural gas in California, and that presentation is online as well as the final report, so you go check that out if you haven't already. Also, if you're not on the research listserv, I encourage you to get on that because you will get email notifications about all of our seminars and when final reports are released. And so we also will have some upcoming projects finishing up, one on renewable hydrogen, and that will probably be available in April, and then another one on natural gas infrastructure that will be available in February, and we'll have seminars for both of those projects that are wrapping up. And we also have some new projects starting up as well, and to get information about the status of those projects, you should sign up for the listserv. And I've received comments from people about these projects, and I really appreciate those comments from the public, and my contact information is on the announcement for the seminar, so please feel free to continue to send comments. Those are always appreciated. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Corinne Scown. She's a research scientist in the Energy Analysis and Environmental Impacts Division at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and the Director of Techno-Economic Analysis at the Joint Bioenergy Institute. So without further ado. That microphone should work.
Could you?
Great. Everybody can hear me? Okay, perfect. So thanks for coming. I know we're getting pretty close to the holidays, and so we very much appreciate those of you who are sticking it out and still available to come see talk about the research that we've been working on for, gosh, is it 3 or 4 years now? It's been a while, about 3. So as she said, I'm Corinne Scown, the PI. Arpad Horvath is here with us, and then I want to acknowledge a couple other researchers who couldn't be here today. Mike Taptich did a huge amount of this work. He was really the point person on some of the optimization and scenario work, and he just recently left our group, and he's now a life cycle assessment researcher at Amazon. So that's been exciting for him. And then Kate Piscopo was a grad student while she worked on this, and she has also moved on. She works at a nonprofit now. So I'll quickly run through the project objectives. Broadly, one of the challenges with advanced fuels is that there are so many different options, and you've probably seen an array of journal papers that come out and technical reports. And in theory, there are all these different ways to make quote-unquote advanced fuels that you can blend at higher ratios than, say, ethanol with gasoline. But it's really tough to sort through those and understand, what has sort of near, mid, or long-term commercial potential. How do they stack up against one another? Of course, every researcher who's doing lab work really wants you to view their process in the most favorable light possible. And so, maybe sometimes they are really fabulous. There are other times when perhaps the researchers have sort of glossed over some of the downsides of the processes. And so our goal was to kind of be this impartial group to sort through what's in the literature, what we know our colleagues are working on, because we've been very plugged into what's been going on at the Energy Biosciences Institute and the Joint Bioenergy Institute, and kind of narrow it down to a tractable number of biofuel production pathways that make sense given the feedstock sort of mix in California, and then do some analysis on those and understand how they stack up from a cost perspective, greenhouse gas emissions, criteria, air pollutants, water. So, we'll sort of analyze the technical feasibility, the relative environmental impacts, what's happening at the sort of small scale right now, pilot and demonstration versus commercial scale, identify areas for future research, where the sort of key weaknesses that we need to address, both from a technical perspective, but also from, an environmental perspective, a cost perspective, and then figure out kind of what are the sort of barriers, ones that we can overcome, and maybe there are some that are more challenging to overcome, and sort of figure out a strategy for updating the analysis, because things are always changing, new research is coming out, and so we have to be able to incorporate that quickly into the analysis if we want to sort of do a refresh at some point and see where things are maybe 5 years from now, maybe even 10 years from now. So I'll go through task by task, basically. The task one, we just wanted to review the literature, kind of understand, and ongoing lab research that we're aware of, even if it's not published, and kind of understand where things stand. And, just a quick bit of background about me. I've been working in bioenergy in some form or another since like fall of 2007, basically. I worked primarily in the Energy Biosciences Institute, which was funded by BP. It was joint between UC Berkeley and University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. And once the funding sort of wound down for that, I ended up sort of transitioning over to the Joint Bioenergy Institute, and that's where I spend about half of my time now. And so, I've had sort of a good perspective about what's been going on in the research space, at least at those two institutes, and sort of more broadly. So when we look at what fuels we're trying to replace, so let's assume the goal is to replace petroleum in some way or another. Gasoline is obviously, it has the largest share. This is in California, so a little over half of our crude oil goes to producing gasoline. The next largest, interestingly, in California is jet fuel, just by a little bit. So that's the slightly darker blue slice there. And then diesel's pretty close at 16%. And so, if we wanted to focus even just on those three slices, that would make a lot of sense. Certainly there's something to be said for looking at heavier fuels, sort of marine fuels, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But that gives you sort of an idea of why we focused on replacing gasoline and diesel primarily. So a quick review of the fuels we're interested in replacing. So diesel is about 75% saturated hydrocarbons, 25% aromatics. Gasoline has aromatics at about the same level, but more of these sort of cyclic molecules, fewer of the straight long chain hydrocarbons. And jet fuels, it's kind of a similar makeup to diesel, a little bit different, but often when people are sort of looking at the mixture of fuel that they've produced in the lab, the sort of potential jet fuel products and potential diesel products often look not dissimilar. And in the military, for example, they've considered moving entirely to jet fuel for the sake of sort of ease of logistics. So, you can use jet fuel in diesel applications. There's some retrofits required, but that's one thing that they've been looking at, is just using jet fuel for stationary generators, for their vehicles, where you would typically be using diesel for some of those land applications. So, general things to note before we really dig into the research. There are a couple different types of what we would call drop-in fuels. The first is you can make a bio-based crude that just goes into petroleum refineries. So that's sort of the first place in the supply chain that you could sort of insert a bio-based liquid. And then, in an ideal world, hands off, it behaves just like crude oil. You don't have to do anything differently. That would be great. I think, to me, that's like the sort of best case scenario, although nobody's really been able to achieve that. Usually the bio-based crudes, you can blend them at a pretty low level before you start having to make changes to your petroleum refinery. The other option is that you have a kind of separate supply chain up until you make the finished product. And then that finished product can at least go into regular petroleum pipelines. And usually when people talk about drop-in fuels, that's what they're talking about, is it can go into all of the same infrastructure. It can go into your engine. You wouldn't know the difference. And that's also pretty challenging for a few reasons that I'll discuss. The term drop-in is used pretty liberally, I've found. So it sounds great. It's a very catchy term. And so it gets used for fuels that you can't actually blend. It's not like a one-to-one. You could just put 100% of this new fuel that you've produced in your engine and it would be fine. It's been used loosely to denote things that can be blended at more than a 10% level. For example, maybe you can blend it at 40 or 50% without having to make any changes to your engine. And maybe it's also infrastructure compatible. And that's because it's actually quite challenging to make something that is completely a one-to-one replacement. And so when we talk about these drop-in fuels, although there hasn't been extensive engine testing done, I would bet that many of these fuels cannot actually be just a 100% replacement. There's probably going to need to be some sort of blend. The reality is that the scale we're looking at, that's not a problem yet, considering the feedstock that's available in state. So yeah, again, just because a process yields hydrocarbons, maybe you make a bunch of wonderful saturated straight chain hydrocarbons. That still doesn't mean it's a one-to-one replacement for diesel, for example. And there may be instances where a fuel is drop-in, but you need some additives. An example would be sort of fuel oil that you could use in a marine application. So you maybe need some stabilizers or something. But in general, it's pretty close to drop-in. And so that's one example of something that's nearly drop-in, but again, the line is blurry. The other challenge with these fuels is that, you'll see results. If any of you have dug into the literature, especially from the national labs, you'll see all of these reports where they do Aspen models and they say, look, you make this amount of gasoline, this amount of diesel, this amount of jet fuel. But because the actual empirical research that's going on is at a really small scale. I mean, most of these labs are making like milliliters of fuel. Engine testing people cannot take a milliliter of fuel and do anything. So, they need like barrels of fuel. And if you are in a small lab, you're sitting there at your bench, you're not going to make barrels of fuel. There's no way. And so there is something of a disconnect with these quote unquote advanced pathways. The research, it just hasn't gotten to a place yet where you're actually going to send it to a pilot facility and try to make enough for the engine testing. And in some cases, it's sort of chicken or the egg. You don't want to make a whole bunch of it just to find out that it's a terrible fuel. On the other hand, you can't do much testing with the sort of volumes that are typically generated at sort of bench scale research. There is a DOE-funded effort to try and bridge that gap called Co-Optima. It's changed names a few times, but basically the notion is that they're trying to bring the fuel production people together with the combustion simulation people and the actual engine testing people. And the notion is that if we're developing advanced engines, so engines are sort of a moving target, we should be developing fuels for the engine of the future, not fuels for the engine of today. And and even I'm involved in that effort. It is not straightforward. Even that has been pretty challenging. And there are a lot of engine testing people who say, well, ethanol is really great. Why would it's high octane? You know how to make it. It's cheaper to make right now than many of the others. Why aren't you just making ethanol? So it's tough. It's really tough to do this. So what is a drop-in diesel? Remember, there are a lot of characteristics that you have to consider in making diesel that works with our existing infrastructure and engines. I will not read through all of these, but these are just some of the characteristics that you have to look at. Typically, biologists or chemists who are trying to synthesize molecules that would work as a diesel fuel are looking at the carbon number. They know, it's more sort of straight chain than aromatic, but, they're saying approximate size looks about right. Probably a diesel or a jet fuel. And so you might write in your paper, this can be used as a diesel molecule or this can be used as jet fuel. There hasn't been testing on it, but you sort of eyeball it and that's the best you can do. fuel testing is critical at the end of the day to really say whether or not it works. And we learned that the hard way with some research into jet fuel. It looked about right, but even at a 10% blend, it didn't perform very well. And you don't know that until you test. So drop-in gasoline, again, there's this kind of distribution of ranges in terms of carbon number, some of the important characteristics, octane number, stability, the energy content. In some cases, something like ethanol does pretty well. In others, like energy content, for example, not so much. So jumping to feedstocks. Why do we care about what kinds of feedstocks when we're trying to pick drop-in fuel pathways to study? Well, the reality is, depending on the kind of composition that you're looking at in your feedstocks, different pathways may make more or less sense. So here's a range of sort of feedstock composition that you might see for typical biomass. Okay, so those first three there are 6 carbon polysaccharides. That means you can break them down into 6 carbon sugars. Bugs generally eat those pretty well, so a biological pathway, if you have a lot of sugars, that's good. There are 5 carbon polysaccharides. So 5 carbon sugars, bugs usually don't eat them as well, but they can still do it. Some can do it. Some engineered, like bacteria, for example, do it less well, and that's sort of a goal for synthetic biologists, but still okay. And then depending on how much lignin you have, or rather the ratio of polysaccharides to lignin, it may make the difference between choosing a biological pathway and a thermochemical pathway. And so the notion is, with the sort of harsh thermochemical pathway, your yields of liquid fuel from lignin aren't great, but they're a lot better than 0, which is what you're getting with a biological pathway. These organisms, at least the ones that are typical in research right now, they don't eat lignin. It's really hard to break down. In fact, some of the enzymes that are released will bond non-productively to the lignin. So the lignin has a negative impact on your yield from the sugars, in addition to itself not really being something you can break down. There are some fungi, for example. I mean, there's a lot of research going, but everybody knows lignin's a problem, and we need to figure out how to do something interesting with it. And so you'll notice that for herbaceous biomass, the ratio of the polysaccharides to the lignin is generally higher. So you'll probably see a lot of reports about, like, dilute acid corns over to ethanol, or to sort of any other process that involves, fermentation or, aerobic breakdown of sugars, and it's herbaceous biomass, and that's why. Whereas woody biomass, if you've dug into the literature, you've probably seen a lot more thermochemical pathways using woody biomass, and that's because the ratio of sugars to lignin tends to be a little bit lower. There's a little more lignin, less sugar. And then, of course, there are all these ash and extractives, which you can recycle the ash and use it as a nutrient on the soil, but other than that, it doesn't do you much good. So the importance of composition. The old industry saying is you can make anything from lignin except money. That's not quite true with thermochemical processes. You break it down, you get some aromatic compounds in the liquid phase, and that's fine. But in general, it poses a challenge, especially for biological pathways. There was a time when we made most of our synthetic vanillin from lignin, from black liquor from paper mills. There was a point in the early 80s, when 60% of all the synthetic vanillin in the global market came from a single plant in Ontario. But the market share has fallen. The petroleum-based pathway has ended up being a little bit cheaper. So in the short term, the best we can hope for is a harsh process that breaks down some of the lignin into something we can use for fuels. It's not more valuable than the fuel, like a high-value chemical, but it's better than nothing. In the long term, you may have a little more precision if you can use catalysis or a biological route to sort of selectively break bonds in the lignin and make perhaps some aromatic compounds, or you don't have to preserve aromaticity, and you'll get something more useful. There's a video online, and I put a link here, but it shows what happens when you pyrolyze lignin. And the reality is you do get some liquid fraction, but a lot of it turns to char, and you'll see it kind of bubble and then just solidify into this hard little particle. And when I was asking around for sort of perspective on what you could make out of lignin, this was the first thing that one of those professors sent me. Let's see, is there a clock? Okay, perfect. So, overview of pathway types. So I've talked about a couple of them. Biological, you're using a host microbe of some sort. It could be bacteria, it could be fungi, to produce your fuels, or you could produce an intermediate that you do some downstream upgrading with. Hybrid biological and chemical. So that's this notion of a sort of biology-based, usually that's the first step, is biology, and then you get some relatively pure compound, or in some cases a mix of compounds, and then you can do some downstream upgrading. So one thing you might want to do is, rather than relying on your bug to get rid of all of the oxygens, you could do like hydrodeoxygenation. Something like that, or maybe you dimerize and trimerize smaller molecules until you get the sort of carbon number that you're looking for. Chemical pathways. So usually you would start with biomass feedstocks, sugars, lipids, and this would be sort of a case where it's sort of not as hot as a thermochemical process, but again, there are no bugs involved. So it could be a room temperature process. And then thermochemical, of course, would be like gasification or pyrolysis. So we went through and looked at sort of what all the options are. And I know that text is it's actually more readable than I thought it would be, but it is pretty small, maybe for those of you in the back of the room. But this is sort of the map of the starting points. So lignocellulosic biomass or organic waste, microalgae that produce lipids, or waste oil. And you can see basically sort of where you can get to starting from those feedstocks using different routes. And so there's, fast pyrolysis, gasification, acid catalyzed breakdown of biomass to some intermediates like furfural, biological pathways. And so the green indicates that ending fuel is sort of pretty close to a 1-to-1 drop-in with minor additives or sort of blend stocks. The purple indicates a drop-in product at a limited blend. The aqua color is a drop-in crude. And again, some of these are not been totally verified, but at least, if it came from a company, they're saying that it works. And then the regular blue is not drop-in, but it can be a blend stock. And so you'll notice that there are a lot more options for diesel than there are for gasoline. That seems to be a pretty consistent theme in the literature, is that it's easier to make a drop-in diesel than it is to make a drop-in gasoline. And that may have something to do with some of the emissions regulations, although I know that's changing for diesel. They're getting stricter. So biological pathways are a useful jumping off point. There are a lot of options. You can make alcohols, you can make hydrocarbons, you can make oils. They're like oleaginous yeast, for example. You can do anaerobic digestion, make biogas, and start from there. And, again, you see there are more options for diesel. So why did we choose to study thermochemical pathways for this project? So although some of the final fuels, haven't gone through the rigorous testing, the blending limits may vary. They're probably not 100%. There's probably some limit to how much of these products you can blend. They are closer to commercialization. The other reason is that California has a lot of woody biomass, and I'll go through that later when we talk about the scenarios, but assuming that we don't want to grow dedicated bioenergy crops like switchgrass, what we have to start with in terms of residues is very sort of skewed towards the woody side. We don't have a lot of herbaceous residue. And so, down the line, there may be biological or hybrid biological and catalytic routes that can offer more sort of control in what you get out. But for now, I think the closest you can get to sort of viable drop-in fuel pathways are these thermochemical routes. So let's go through the routes that we looked at. So the first is fast pyrolysis. And so you get to a kind of biocrude, which you could blend at a low rate, at a low sort of level in a petroleum refinery. But we assume that you are sort of doing this process in a dedicated biorefinery all the way to the final product. So you heat the biomass rapidly. You have to grind it up into sort of fine particles. It's about 400 to 600 degrees C, so it's a little bit lower temperature than some of the other processes we'll talk about. You thermally decompose the biomass. You end up getting a mixture of gaseous, solid, and liquid products, and that's basically always the case even with gasification. You get some mixture of those, just the notion is sort of controlling what catalyst you're using and the reaction conditions to get the mix that you want. So pyrolysis is geared toward maximizing the liquid fraction. And then you can hydrotreat the bio oil and crack it into gasoline and diesel products. So this is the sort of process flow diagram. I know there's a lot of information in there. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through everything, but you're basically drying the biomass, grinding it, pyrolyzing it. You have to clean up the vapors. You end up with a gaseous product that you can, let's see, in this case, I think we reform a mixture of that plus some extra natural gas to get the hydrogen that you need for hydrotreating. And then the remainder of like the solid product and some of the gaseous product, you can use those for on-site process heat and electricity. Pyrolysis has the highest yield of all the processes that we look at, but the downside to that is that you don't have as much waste to use to generate your hydrogen and your electricity and heat on site. So you need to bring in some fossil fuel, some natural gas. And so from an emissions perspective, it looks worse, but that's because more of your biomass is going to the product that you actually want. So they could, use somebody else's biogas from an anaerobic digester or something, and that would help. But that's sort of the downside to higher yield is actually the greenhouse gas emissions usually look worse. The next pathway is gasification and Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. This makes primarily diesel. It's a relatively mature process, and we've talked about it for other like fossil fuels. I mean, there's been talk of doing this with coal, for example, back when oil prices were really high. You can do this with natural gas, but you're basically making syngas. You're making carbon monoxide and hydrogen. It occurs at higher temperatures, like 800 degrees C, and then you use the water-gas shift reaction to get the right ratio of hydrogen and carbon monoxide, and the Fischer-Tropsch reaction grows these diesel chains. And this is the process flow diagram. I'm always happy to revisit this stuff towards the end if you guys want to get into the details of the process. But again, on-site heat and electricity, and in this case, it's a net exporter of energy. So the next pathway starts with the same first step, gasification, and then there's the methanol to gasoline process that synthesizes gasoline. So it's, again, a relatively mature process. It's something that, let's see, Exxon has built at least one plant for. This is something that came up in Co-Optima as well, and there was some debate about the properties of the fuel. Maybe it wasn't high octane enough is what I recall the engine people saying. So who knows, maybe it's not that great. But, it may depend on what catalyst you're using sort of in terms of the mixture. But 800 to 900 degrees C is the operating temperature, so similar to gasification in the previous step. Again, you have syngas, you get to the right ratio, and then there's this two-step, methanol synthesis, and then the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, which is actually a number of steps before you get to the mixture of saturated like alkanes and aromatics. And so this is the process flow diagram for gasification and methanol to gasoline. And again, happy to revisit more of these details at the end if you'd like. So let's talk about how these look in the California context, given all of the biomass that we have. So we came up with a set of scenarios, and the idea was to establish some objective functions and constraints of interest, and then kind of see where that gets us. So the first three scenarios, we sort of looked at maximizing, one fuel or another or all. So maximize gasoline, maximize diesel, or maximize like total fuel yield, and you don't care like what kind of fuel you're making. Sourcing always California feedstocks. We did actually run a little bit of analysis just out of curiosity with data we already had to see sort of how much biomass there would be just outside the state borders. But for the purposes of this project, we focused on just feedstock available in California. Again, depending on the scenario, you make some mixture of gasoline or diesel or just one or the other. For the centralized scenarios, we looked at minimizing greenhouse gas emissions to see where that got us. And then we were interested in a couple of different strategies. So one, you're just building new biorefineries wherever you want. In another scenario, you're co-locating your biorefineries with petroleum refineries. So the notion would be that there may be some shared infrastructure. If you need extra hydrogen, perhaps you'd like to, import hydrogen from the petroleum refinery if they have it. Maybe it's useful for them to do the blending on site, and then it just enters the infrastructure, right, the sort of fuel distribution infrastructure right there. And then for the distributed scenarios where we have lots of little facilities, we looked at a sort of scenario where you basically want to minimize the blending level. So let's say these fuels aren't so fabulous as one-to-one drop-in. And so you want to kind of spread it out as best you can amongst all the retail stations. So nobody has a really high blend and nobody has a really low blend. They all have like a, 14% blend or whatever it is. And we wanted to see what that looked like. So there is a model. It's on GitHub for anybody who doesn't know what GitHub is or just wants to know more about it. You're more than welcome to come talk to me. This is some of the work that Mike Taptich led, but I will do my best to answer your questions. And of course, you can dig around in the code and the data sets that it generated online, freely available. It's sort of wiki style. You can even leave comments and stuff. And I guarantee you, we will read comments. There's not been a ton of activity, so we would be really excited if somebody actually wrote something. Okay. So distribution of biomass in California. I mentioned that we are pretty sort of woody biomass heavy, and you can really see that in this biomass availability chart up at the top right. So forest residue, primary mill, those together make almost 3/4 of our total solid biomass resources. We did not look at like food waste, any of these kind of heterogeneous like wet wastes that you wouldn't want to send through a process that requires drying first. So this is like solid, relatively dry biomass, not wet waste. Crop residues make up about 1/4 of our total biomass resources. And you can see that a lot of the forest residue in particular is concentrated up north. Now, how that'll change with the bark beetle infestation and the drought, which are related, yet to be seen, but I think there's a lot of tree mortality happening in the more central part of the state, and there's Sierra Nevadas. And so, we may see more forest residue becoming available in those regions. I think this map may very well shift over the next 5 years or so, depending on forest management practices. Okay, so potential biorefinery locations. So, I still have the feedstock availability chart up just for reference. In the red dots, you can see new development for drop-in fuel. So there's no facility there right now. These are locations that we would be considering. The black, or rather it looks kind of gray on this chart, are existing petroleum refineries. Orange are biodiesel refineries we have in the state. And then green are existing ethanol facilities. So you can see they're concentrated in the Central Valley, although we do have a few in the south and on the coast. We also looked at bulk fuel terminals. So, that's an important part of the sort of logistics picture, is understanding once you have a liquid fuel product, where it can go. And of course, those are all built based on where the petroleum refineries are right now. That makes total sense. That's not to say that we wouldn't necessarily build new bulk terminals if we had a bunch of fuel being produced like up north where all the forest residue is. But for now, this is our infrastructure. And since we're looking at sort of drop-in given what's already built. That's what we wanted to look at first. So these are defined as bulk storage with a capacity of greater than 50,000 barrels. And yeah, there was some, we didn't have storage capacity data for these terminals or individual storage capacity, but we did our best to estimate that, and I'd be happy to discuss sort of the methods for doing that. So the cost and life cycle assessment, let's talk about the yields first. So as I mentioned, pyrolysis generally had the highest fuel yield, and you can see here, it varies depending on who's modeling it and where the actual experimental results came from. And again, typically the process is people are doing little pieces of these processes at a pretty small scale, and then somebody, a team ideally, is responsible for building sort of a hypothetical, it's usually like an Aspen model or a Super Pro model of what a commercial scale facility would look like. So, NREL, PNNL, it's not like they have some big facility that they're running and they're just collecting data and reporting it. This is very much simulated data. And their assumptions, we used a lot of their assumptions and their modeling results. So pyrolysis, usually the sort of weight yield is somewhere between like 20-26%. You can see that converted to gallons of gasoline equivalent per metric ton of biomass. For Fischer-Tropsch and MTG, it hovers around more like 15% or so. But again, these are different feedstocks. So it'll vary a little bit. I would guess that with pyrolysis, it might even go up a bit if you were doing all herbaceous biomass. But it's tough to say. So energy demand by pathway. The electricity demand for pyrolysis and gasification is actually higher than for pyrolysis where you're getting hydrogen from offsite. But we have found that even with a similar configuration, it's hard to say who's right. There are multiple models that sort of give you different energy demand, and trying to kind of reconcile those and understand how their assumptions are leading to such different results was a real challenge for us. But in general, pyrolysis sort of required actually quite a bit of energy beyond what was available from the biomass. Nth plant assumptions. So these are all pretty standard. A 10% IRR is what everybody uses. There are some industry people who've said, oh, it should be 20%. That's very aggressive. Like that would make it really tough to be cost competitive, but there have been some people who've given that feedback. Again, we can go through some of these financial parameters later for those who are interested. So in summary, the first thing to note is that these thermochemical pathways tend to be less capital intensive than biological pathways. And so it's going to be easier to get a thermochemical plant financed. And, at the end of the day, when we did our best to sort of normalize the modeling results that are out there, the capital costs were pretty similar. Fischer-Tropsch ended up being a little bit higher, but they're all kind of in the same ballpark. And when you actually looked at minimum selling price, they're quite close. In fact, Fischer-Tropsch ended up being the highest because of the higher operational costs, as well as capital costs. Plant life. So there were a couple things that we noticed were inconsistent, and it's unclear if those were based on technical realities or if those are just different assumptions that people make. One is plant lifetime, 20 years versus 30 years. 30 years is pretty standard. 20 years seems kind of short, but there were some studies that varied on that. And also sort of construction period, whether it's 2.5 or 3 years, although that didn't make as much of a difference. So emission factors, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but one important takeaway is that we assume that biogenic carbon does not count. So we say, all right, the plant is sequestering atmospheric CO2, so any carbon that's released when you're burning char or the gaseous product is zero. It all sort of balances out. So greenhouse gas emissions for comparison, you can see sort of how that stacks up and sort of the different components, how they contribute to the overall greenhouse gas footprint. It does depend on what electricity mix you use, and I don't know sort of if there's a standard assumption for CAMX versus WEC. We tend to use WEC, but we did do a sensitivity analysis with both. And so the final results, if we look at yield and greenhouse gas emissions. So if you don't include electricity credits, methanol to gasoline and Fischer-Tropsch are basically like zero carbon for the biorefinery. So they don't use any fossil carbon. There's a little bit for construction, but like normalized over the plant life and the total production, it's basically zero. For pyrolysis, the emissions are quite a bit higher, and that's just because you use so much of the biomass for your liquid fuel that you don't have enough sort of waste left to supply energy at the plant. Again, purchasing any sort of renewables would technically solve this problem. But the yield is also higher for pyrolysis than it is for Fischer-Tropsch and methanol to gasoline by almost 50%. So greenhouse gas emissions using system expansion, once you look at the electricity offset credit for the two types of facilities that are net exporters of electricity, they become negative, and this range reflects different electricity mixes that you may be offsetting, anything from like just assuming only natural gas to CAMX and WEC. We also did criteria air pollutant emissions, and in general, these are quite a bit lower than for, say, gasoline or diesel. However, we didn't want to do a comparison because the actual tailpipe emissions for these fuels are not well characterized. As I mentioned, we're not producing them at the sort of quantities that you would really need to do engine testing, and so until we have a better sense for what the tailpipe emissions differences are for like a blend versus just sort of regular gasoline or diesel, I think a comparison would be almost misleading. But yeah, compared to the sort of upstream emissions for gasoline or diesel, these all look pretty good. There was some question about the PM emissions for any facility that burns char on site, and there's the sort of regulatory considerations. So in California, what we ended up settling on is that basically, you're not going to be able to site that facility unless you can meet the same standards that a natural gas boiler, for example, can meet. And so that was what we assumed. They meet the same standards as for a natural gas boiler. And even then, there's some variation depending on what facility you're looking at in California, sort of what values they were permitted for. Fischer-Tropsch, again, these are all quite a bit lower. There were more SOx emissions. So remember, for Fischer-Tropsch and methanol to gasoline, you're burning more biomass fuel on site, so char, and any sulfur that's left there. You still do flue gas desulfurization, but you do have higher SOx emissions than for pyrolysis, where you're burning less biomass fuel on site and more natural gas. And so methanol to gasoline, again, you have pretty high carbon monoxide emissions, and that's from combustion of the light products. And then you can see the SOx emissions are up there too. So total sort of net emissions with the electricity offset credits, many of these could be strongly negative. And that's because if you're offsetting electricity, there are emissions associated with that as well, especially if you're in WEC. That includes a fair amount of coal. Although shrinking, a lot of coal plants in the U.S., WEC included, are being decommissioned. But pyrolysis ends up being the only one that's sort of consistently positive. Many of the other ones are net negative. So water results, we found that in general, the thermochemical pathways are not problematic from a water perspective. They tend to use the same or generally less water than like typical petroleum fuels, and certainly less water than any biological pathway. You're generally trying to keep water like as far away from your fuels and your intermediates as possible. Once you dry that biomass, you really don't want excess water in your system. And so most of the water associated with these is just like makeup water and cooling water. And so if you have a closed loop cooling system, you are using some water, but generally it's pretty small. So just going through our scenarios quickly, I talked about what the sort of assumptions are, the objective functions and the constraints behind each of these earlier. Let's see. It does look lower resolution here than it did on my computer, but hopefully you can still see it. This is where you really get to see a sense of scale. So I think, to me at least, that's helpful, and kind of the geographic distribution of the fuel production. So, the first thing to note is if we're maximizing gasoline output, that means we can offset about 10% of total gasoline demand in the state and about 14 or so percent of diesel use in the state. So it's not a huge amount, but again, this is with no dedicated biomass crops. This is just with the residue that's available. And you can see the total production numbers here. There would be 40 biorefineries using 26 bulk terminals, and a lot of that production is concentrated in the sort of northern and central part of the state. If we want to maximize diesel, you can really take a chunk out of the diesel market, in part because the diesel market is smaller. But you can offset about 65% of diesel demand in the state with these drop-in fuels. And in that case, you still do make a little bit of gasoline because these processes generally produce multiple products. So you're about 6% of gasoline demand. And yeah, again, sort of concentration of production in the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. If you want to maximize total fuel output, skew more towards diesel. That's something that comes up again and again, is like even though gasoline is a larger market, I think there are a few reasons why focusing on diesel is not a bad idea. The first is that you have a lot more options in terms of processes that get you to sort of drop-in-esque diesel product. The other argument for that is it's going to be really hard to electrify heavy-duty freight, in the same way that it's going to be really hard to electrify air travel. And so looking at jet fuel and diesel replacements may be a really good long-term strategy because those sectors have fewer options. Passenger transportation, makes up a lot of gasoline demand. You may be able to take a pretty big chunk out of that with electrification, or at least I certainly hope so. So in this case, you offset about 60% of diesel market and about 8% of retail gasoline market. And so this, I should mention, we say retail because this does not include the wholesale market. It is smaller, but it's an important sort of technicality to note. Scenario 3, incentivize only new growth. So in that case, the focus, you still make more diesel, but you make less fuel in general. So you can see the numbers here. It sort of totals to about 2,000. This is about 1,500 million gallons per year. If we focus on co-location, so rather than in scenario 3 where we're looking at just new biorefineries, trying to build biorefineries that are sort of attached to petroleum refineries, you still get about a pretty similar sort of mix between diesel and gasoline, and you get a little less, about the same total production. It was interesting. We sort of brought this up to BP, who was, they were our funders a few years ago. And, we asked them if that was something that would be interesting. A lot of these oil companies are investing in bioenergy research. Would you want to co-locate a biorefinery with your petroleum refineries? And they felt that that was a big perception issue, that if you're going to build a clean, renewable site, you really don't want to put it next to a petroleum refinery. It's going to make people feel a lot less warm and fuzzy about your biorefinery. So I thought that was interesting. It's really not not relevant from an engineering perspective, but at the end of the day, those sorts of things may actually determine what choices are made about how to build these out. Incentivizing distributed growth. This is it. I mean, the results look basically the same as the last two scenarios. In fact, they're like exactly the same. Equal blending. So again, very similar results. And the idea here is that you have sort of 8.5% blend throughout the state and a 20% blend throughout the state for diesel. So what does it look like in terms of logistics? Transportation is something that is brought up as a sort of argument for drop-in fuels, is like, then we don't have to truck this stuff around. You can just put it in pipelines. The reality is that a lot of the ton kilometers that happen are upstream. It's moving the biomass that's the worst part of the sort of fuel, the bioenergy supply chain in terms of transportation. And so if you can find a way to get that biomass on a rail line, that really helps. California, unfortunately, does not have the sort of extensive rail infrastructure that many other states have. And so what we found is there's biomass out of state that you could transport in for lower or similar greenhouse gas emissions, even though it's farther, because once you get it on a rail line, your energy intensity of transporting it, the emissions intensity drops dramatically. But you can see there's quite a bit of road transportation involved in getting the biomass to the biorefinery and getting it to fueling terminals. So changes in emissions from the 2015 baseline, they are reductions. So that's good. So, we compared our scenarios, their results, to a sort of business as usual. And the result was you get anywhere from a 5% to, let's see, I guess the high is like a 13% reduction in total emissions for producing that volume of fuel. Again, reductions in NOx, PM, SOx, CO2. There is not a single plus here to be found. The reductions are modest, but given the volume of fuel that we're producing, where you're only sort of offsetting, say, 10% or so of the gasoline market, or maybe a larger share of diesel, that's actually pretty significant. So well-to-pump emissions, maximizing diesel, I think that is the only one that has strongly positive emissions. Again, it's still less than petroleum fuel, but these are the greenhouse gas emissions. They all end up being net negative because of those electricity exports. And these are the emission factors. Just so you have the numbers, I'll jump over that slide, but we can revisit it if you'd like. So, having done all this analysis, what are the sort of key issues that we found and research needs? The first is the interesting issue of fuel yield. So the way we do these emissions calculations now with system expansion, which is an LCA person, I think very highly of system expansion. I think these offset credits are the most appropriate way to represent sort of net system-wide change in emissions, for example, as a result of building a biorefinery. The downside is that they basically make any biorefinery that is very efficient at converting all the biomass to fuel, that tends to look worse because we assume that, they would be buying, say, natural gas to generate process heat, electricity that they need on site. They certainly could make arrangements to buy renewable fuel, and maybe we need to be kind of running scenarios where that's assumed. But that's something that comes up again and again. Even at JBay, there's talk about figuring out biological routes to using lignin. The downside using lignin is, like, right now, that's your source of, you burn lignin and biogas to generate heat and electricity, and you get a really big offset credit for that electricity that you export. And I don't know if we should be sort of analytically punishing the facilities that produce more of the fuel that we ultimately want because they don't export as much electricity. There are some methodological ways around that we can talk about, but That's one thing that does come up, is our highest yielding pathway ended up sort of looking the worst from a greenhouse gas perspective. Hydrogen requirements are big. If you can get quote unquote, renewable green hydrogen, either from, artificial photosynthesis or, electrolysis hooked up to solar panels or wind, that's great. That helps a lot. Sugar utilization, if we can get better at using C5 and C6 sugars in biological pathways, that'll go a long way to making those more viable. A lot of the advanced fuels that you've probably read about that are coming out of, the top synthetic biology laboratories they're using process conditions that are not conducive to a commercialized biorefinery. And they are often just using glucose, and it's a big step to go from using glucose to utilizing all the C6 and C5 sugars. But that's really a sort of barrier, but I think it's something that's technologically possible. It's, from a research perspective, that's not necessarily what gets you the science paper. You make some cool molecule, they don't care about what sugar it came from, but at the end of the day, to commercialize it, you need to use all the sugars. A clean sugar stream requirement, that's a big challenge with biomass. Separations, to sort of get there are, it's a challenge for biological processes, and it's a challenge for catalytic processes where, you have to make sure that your catalysts aren't deactivated. Co-products, how we account for co-products, very much tied to this yield issue. There are sort of possibilities for utilizing co-products differently. So we always assume that you burn char on site for heat and electricity. There are companies looking for higher value uses of char. I think at a commercial scale, you would probably saturate those markets pretty quickly. But, they're looking at, I had a company ask me if they could use their char for Brita filters. It's any sort of higher value use other than burning it. That you can find. Certainly companies will be looking into that. So we'll have to keep an eye on what they do. Biocrude compatibility in petroleum refineries, I found that every company I've talked to about utilizing biocrude, it's not very stable. It's corrosive. They would use it in very small blends. I've yet to meet a biocrude that you could use at a really high blend in a petroleum refinery. But it is interesting, and certainly if we can make biocrude that's more compatible, I think that would be a wonderful way to go. Engine and system compatibility, we talked about that a little bit, and so the challenges that Co-Optima is trying to overcome, but there is very much a disconnect between the volume of fuels that are being made in basic research and the amount that you need to do engine testing and see if it's really worth pursuing and it's sort of scaling up. And I think there probably needs to be research funded in that area. That pipeline isn't quite complete yet. There's still kind of a disconnect. People are working on it, but it's not quite there yet. The well-to-wheel criteria, air pollutant emissions it's a challenge to come up with sort of definitive numbers for those because it's very dependent on the regulatory environment. And so we generated these results for California, and I'm fairly confident that although they may be a little conservative, they're about right for California. And we had some really extensive conversations with some other folks at ARB. Anil, who's here, gave us great feedback. But would those results be sort of representative in Pennsylvania? Well, probably not. It's at the end of the day, what you get permitted for, it sort of determines your emissions control technology. And then potential production scale, I think California is limited in that our land is quite valuable. We don't have the same sort of land available for dedicated biomass crops that some other states might be able to allocate. And so, you're not, with the present biomass availability, you are not going to be able to completely offset all gasoline and diesel with drop-in fuels. But I would argue that you don't need to. I think it's part of a suite of options. And so if you are doing things to electrify passenger transportation, for example, drop-in fuels can be a really important piece of this puzzle, and they are absolutely worth continuing to work on, and certainly worth investing in some pilot and demonstration facilities. So strategies to monitor and track progress. I mentioned our wiki-style GitHub site. The link is here. Please feel free to visit it, play around with the code if you want to make changes. There are ways to, you can fork it and and then share with us your updates, and we can actually update the model based on your input. Even if there are parameters that you think we should change, those are all things that we can do. So the idea here is that this should live on beyond the life of the project, and we would welcome feedback from any of you. Here's our contact info. You're welcome to call or email us. And with that, I think we've got some time for questions.
All right. Oh, great. You can hear me. So we have gotten several questions online, and I know there are going to be many in the audience. I just want to warn everyone that I will alternate between the internet and the audience until we run out of time. And if you don't get your question answered, remember you can always follow up with the researchers. They presented their contact information online, or you can contact me as well. And I also just wanted to just make sure everyone knows that the PowerPoint presentation is available online, as well as the final report. So I'm going to start with a question that we got online. The first question that we got was from Mark Bunch from BP. He asked, how much work has been undertaken to understand whether there are real-world issues with seal shrinkage associated with the drop-in aromatics from switching from fossil diesel to high-ratio renewable diesel blends?
Oh, all right. So this is the kind of testing that we certainly cannot do. The only thing I've heard about seals, and it wasn't let's see, it was in the context of ketones. There was some notion, and this was actually in collaboration with BP. In fact, I think BP did the testing. But I'd worked with a group that made ketones that they thought might be usable themselves as a diesel blend stock. Like they wouldn't even have to do HDO. And they corroded the rubber seals. I remember that. And it was actually useful to know because this ketones came up in co-optima as a potential advanced fuel, and I could say, they already did the testing, and there were some people who said, oh yeah, they are corrosive. I'm aware of that. But again, this is the kind of testing where it's really useful to have industry partners, because our work with BP is that's really the only time when they sort of tested system compatibility in that way. Even with co-optima, I think they're much more focused on combustion, and they're not necessarily looking at the system compatibility. And so, yeah, I mean, there may be some work out there that I'm not aware of, but that's basically sort of the challenge I see, is that you do sort of one-off testing when you have an industry partner.
Thank you for your presentation. It was a really good presentation. I just want to ask your thoughts on soil organic carbon and if the biomass in California can be sustainably harvested.
Yeah. So from a forest, it's funny you should mention this. I got an email about this recently, and we also the CEC is going to fund some work in this area. But from a forest management perspective, there are significant advantages to removing woody biomass. Mostly because we don't allow the sort of natural fires to happen for a lot of reasons, protecting property, critical infrastructure. I mean, there are reasons why we can't just let sort of nature take its course in the way it would have if there were no people here. And so, when I've talked to our collaborators in forest management, they say it's really crucial to sort of minimize the fire risk by removing some of this wood. And the fires can, they release a lot of soil organic carbon. They have sort of air quality impacts, significant air quality impacts, which anybody who's lived in California for a long enough period of time, you've probably experienced them. And there are, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there should also be some emissions of sort of more potent greenhouse gases from these fires. I mean, certainly you would be getting methane if you're like basically pyrolyzing wood. I think the assumptions that are built into our estimates of availability are actually pretty conservative, especially given the recent tree die-off in California. There are some kind of rules of thumb for how much you can sustainably remove. But what we'd really like to do, and hopefully will do in future studies, is actually look on a parcel level at the forest land, and based on how it's being managed. So private land is managed differently than like U.S. Forest Service. Ironically, the U.S. Forest Service apparently they do not manage their land in a way that minimizes fire risk. And so there may be more biomass available on those parcels than on some of the private land. It's something to get into, and we're actually working with a group in Earth Sciences at LBL on that topic. So we'll be running some models to get a sense for what's happening with soil organic carbon under these scenarios.
Great, thanks. So we have another question from the web from Roger Galt from the Truck and Engine Manufacturers Association. He asks, for the gasoline and diesel fuels being discussed, are the finished fuel standards those dictated by ARB, marketplace consensus standards, or others? So
hopefully I mentioned this in the presentation, but we explicitly did not look at tailpipe emissions. The upstream criteria air pollutant emissions are consistent with sort of permitted acceptable levels for comparable facilities. And so we looked at air quality management district data, like ARB data. I mean, we sort of did, I think it was EPA that had a database of all the permitted facilities and sort of what levels they were permitted for. But if you're talking about tailpipe emissions, we specifically did not look at that because there is not enough testing data on how these fuels perform, not only by themselves, but in various blends, because there could be non-linearities there.
Yeah, also some of the future research that I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation is going to be looking at emissions from tailpipes of advanced technology vehicles that are vocational vehicles, medium and heavy duty, as well as alternative fuels. So we're hoping that this new research will give us, give us the full life cycle. We have the well-to-wheel, so now we need the tailpipe emission, and that project won't include blends, but that's certainly on our wish list, and it's almost Christmas. All right, so is there another question from the audience?
To what extent can we use the model to look at the new feedstock availability from the tree mortality and how that would affect the distribution or recommended locations?
Yes. My recollection of how the model is set up is that you should be able to amend those feedstock availability numbers. I believe they're on a county level. There will be, if we get funded to do it, there may be more sort of finer resolution data coming out of LBL in the next few years that explicitly includes the tree mortality data. So my understanding is people don't actually have great data sets on the updated sort of biomass available because of the tree mortality. So that's something we're hoping to do, and it'll be really interesting to see how that changes things, not just in the short term, but in the long term. So you figure somebody who is considering, building a biorefinery doesn't want to build it based on feedstock availability that's only going to be sort of spiking in the next couple years. You want to know what the long-term projection is, and that has a lot to do with how we manage our forests going forward. And who knows, maybe there will be some changes in how we do that, given sort of future drought risk and resulting fire risk.
All right, so we're going to take another question from the web. This one is from Julia Levin from the Bioenergy Association of California. She asks, thank you for a very interesting presentation with a certification by ARB and US EPA of the Cummins Westport ultra-low NOx engine for heavy-duty natural gas engines. Will the research team do additional research to assess the potential for woody cellulosic waste to be converted to renewable natural gas, i.e. gasification and then methanation? This seems like a huge opportunity with much lower GHG and NOx emissions than going to renewable diesel or gasoline substitutes.
So the short answer is our project is over, so no. It is really important. And I have a couple of other projects ongoing at the lab where we've been looking at biogas production, not from woody biomass, but from wet waste, like food waste, general like yard waste. I mean, we've been looking at a variety of sources. And it's been really challenging financially for any facilities that decided to just use their biogas to generate electricity. For a variety of technical and sort of cost reasons. And the ones that seem to be having the most success are the ones who've done, biogas production, clean it up, CNG, link up ideally with like a fleet of vehicles that you can use your CNG. But that seems to be the direction that things are moving on the biogas side. And I think that's great. I think there's still a place for liquid fuels, absolutely, but there may be some applications where it makes a lot of sense to go a CNG route.
Right.
I just had two questions. One, was there any scenarios done on potentially maximizing for jet fuel? And then I'd also be curious, the billion-ton study update is really not enough detail to make financial decisions in building refineries when I was looking at it. Is that going to be updated, and sort of what are the sources of that data that we were using?
Yeah. Okay. So on the jet fuel, we didn't focus on jet fuel. We focused on gasoline and diesel, in part because the pathways that we look at, there are some options. I think if you're using different catalysts where you can make some jet fuel. Unless it's been tested and proven to work as a jet fuel, I tend to be skeptical of drop-in jet fuel pathways, only because it's really tough to make a jet fuel that works even at low blend levels, and airlines are rightfully so quite conservative in sort of agreeing to adopt an alternative fuel. When they do blends, it's like 1% or 2%. It's really small, and so that wasn't something we focused on in this study. But that's not to say it's not important. It was mostly just a sort of question of where we wanted to put our finite effort. I have worked on some jet fuel studies in the past. We have a paper in PNAS that I'd be happy to share, where it was a hybrid biological and catalytic route to producing jet fuels and lubricants. And the jet fuels, they didn't perform as well as we had hoped in fuel testing. And I think that it can probably be improved, but it's challenging to make good jet fuels. On the billion-ton update, the most recent update, I agree. The granularity is not great. In terms of the cost data, unfortunately, That's what we have. I have a parallel project that's like, it's a couple years behind this one. Like it just started a year ago, but we are doing a much more detailed, again, this is parcel level inventory of all the biomass in California, all the crop residues, all the wet biomass. So it goes beyond what we looked at in this study. And we're looking for the best ways to utilize those for energy and also make sure that we account for alternative uses. So you certainly don't want to be using a biomass that's basically already spoken for because it's used as like an animal feed amendment or something. And so we're looking into that as well. And yeah, we use the billion ton update data, but I agree that it could be improved, and hopefully in the next few years it will be.
All right, and another question from the web from Chad White from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Are you considering the drop-in fuel options for mobile and stationary engines simultaneously or non-differentially? I may have missed your mention of or distinction of engine types during your seminar, and we are curious about the potential replacement for diesel generators.
So we focused on their use for mobile engines, although, again, we did not do the tailpipe emissions. So in some ways, this wasn't, we looked at fuel terminals, but in some ways, sort of, once you buy the diesel, like where you decide to use it wasn't relevant for our study because we're just looking up until sort of the fueling station and that's it. It's important, and there may be some work to be done in sort of differentiating the characteristics between the kind of diesel that you can use in a stationary engine. We did look briefly at other types of fuels, like, as I mentioned, we looked at marine fuel as a possibility. Somebody asked about that in one of our progress report meetings. And you could use some heavier, like, product, basically the biocrude. You could stabilize the biocrude and use that in marine fuel. But whether or not that's good for stationary engines, not sure. But certainly the diesel that we're modeling the production of here, you could use in a stationary engine. That's.
Well, thank you so much for a great presentation, and it was really great working with both of you throughout this project, and you were very responsive and worked closely with ARB staff, and we really appreciate that. So everyone should be sure to check out the report online. It's really great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Happy holidays.